Okay, if you didn't get pick up, we've got new notes and we have some old notes. We're going to finish up the last piece starting on page 4 of our notes from last week. And we're going to pick up Protestantism in France, finish that up, and then the lesson we're actually supposed to be on today, we're going to be talking about the Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation, depending on who you quote. But we've seen all sorts of things happening. If you've noticed, we're going to be today really getting towards the end of what is typically referred to as the Reformation time period. Next week we'll be picking up in sort of stuff that's sort of what most people would consider post-Reformation, starting in the 17th century or the 1600s. We'll venture a little bit into that today, but when you really begin to think about it, the Reformation time period started, the precursors of it, 150 years earlier, and then it ran for a century, almost, of what would be considered Reformation and Counter-Reformation. And this particular time is something that we see politics involved, we see economics involved, we see education involved, we see all sorts of stuff involved. And none of it is straightforward. So the craziness in the world, what we see today, is the same craziness in the world they saw then. And as much as it would be wonderful for us to believe that everybody sat down, pulled their Bibles out, and had an honest, straightforward debate, we all know that that rarely happens, even amongst people who agree with each other, right? Isn't it interesting how we find our differences so much more easily and we spend more time on our differences than we do on our similarities? That seems to be endemic to the human condition. And this morning we're going to pick up here and looking at Protestantism in France. Now, just minor stage setting, France itself was probably the most developed from the nation-state idea. Larger area, more people, strong monarchy, very strong monarchy at this particular time, and they sort of embodied the modern nation-state. Spain was pretty strong, Austria, England was developing it, Germany, I'm not sure Germany ever develops it, though it has those kinds of features. But we also see that France is embroiled in constant conflict with the Habsburg dynasties, Charles V and Philip II. And they ruled Spain, Germany, Austria, part of Italy, and the Low Countries, as we've talked about, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. So France is right in the middle of that. So he's in the rulers of France, the kings of France, are constantly in conflict with them. So what do you think is going to happen when it comes to religious involvement? And if you're surrounded by somebody who's staunchly Catholic, even though you have the good old Lutheran heretics over in Germany and they're invading in other parts of your area, what do you think the rulers of France are going to end up doing? Again, we're talking rulers of France, not theologians. We're talking about, what do you think the rulers of France, the politicians, the kings? Anybody have a guess of what you're going to probably see in that particular realm? Conflict, true. The enemy of my enemy. The enemy of my enemy, yes, is my friend. And what we're going to see is conflict, and it's going to be people changing sides constantly. I'm a Protestant, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Protestant. The Protestants help this group of Catholics against that Catholic who's a Protestant who's, so religion and state are still there. And whoever is going to help me with whatever my political ambition is going to be good. And if it's more convenient for me to turn on them later, it will. And if I'm a ruler and my people won't accept me unless I become some other religion, I will do so. Because then they accept me, and oh, by the way, I can still now, as ruler, affect the people I actually support. Nothing is straightforward going on in France. As a matter of fact, France is constantly at war for 40, 50 years, both with Charles, with the Pope, with Philip, in themselves. And we're going to see that as it plays out. So it's not an easy ride if you are in France. It's one of the reasons John Calvin and many other reformers left France and went to Geneva and Strasbourg and places like that because of this fight. Now, one of the things that's going to come into play here is the Kingdom of Navarre. Assuming, by the way, if anybody knows how French pronunciation or Spanish pronunciation, feel free to correct my very bad French and Spanish pronunciation, because I'm terrible with it, so I'm not even going to try in some of these places. So Navarre may be completely incorrect. But this is basically a little kingdom on the border between France and Spain. So the Pyrenees Mountains sort of run as a border between the countries. Navarre is right in that region. So it ends up being a place that is going to have a significant impact on the Reformation in France and Spain, because it becomes a bastion of Protestantism, and therefore it's a place that everybody can sort of sneak stuff in and then distribute north and south to France and Spain. Kind of interesting, and we're going to see the kings that come through that whole line here in a minute. The reason this is important is because a lady named Margaret, who happens to be Francis's sister, Francis of France, marries King Henry of Navarre. And she is the one who helps Protestant leaders, who, encourages Bible distribution, Protestant theology, etc. So Henry of Navarre and Margaret now link in and tie France and Navarre together. They already are sort of tied together. But they now are going to have a strong influence on protecting those that are involved in Protestantism. We're going to see all of the Henrys as they work out. By the way, there's 3 Henrys, and Henry VIII isn't one of them. So it's like, okay, how many Henrys do I have to take into? And one of them's a pair's named after, Henry of Anjou. Anjou pears. It's not named after him, but the region, the family. He's named after the pear? Maybe. But Francis, who happens to be the ruler of France, dies in 1547. And this is the same year King Henry VIII dies. And this is about the same time Luther dies. Okay, so this is kind of puts you time period where we are. Francis dies, and his son Henry II continues his father's policies. And his father's policies were, if it works for me, then it's good, and I'll change sides and who I support and don't support, depending on who I happen to be in. Henry continues on, but he's much crueler about it. He's much more vicious about it. During this particular time, as you can imagine, we've developed Calvin's doctrine in the Genevan Academy and all this other kind of stuff that's developing in what he's done in Geneva. And the Protestant churches in France organize themselves around this type of pattern that Calvin established of how churches sit together. And they had their own confession of faith and what they call a discipline. And they adopted this in a secret meeting in Paris, okay, because they still were kind of underground. Now, Henry dies relatively quickly, and he leaves 4 sons, 3 of which are going to become king. Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. Okay, so this is one of the other Henrys. He also has a daughter who is going to become queen. And this is another Margaret, but it's Margaret of Valois. What's that? Valois, whatever. I'm American. It's a Valois. I dropped the S on it. That's my homage to French. I know that you have to drop that S if you have a vowel at the end of whatever. But Margaret, the other Margaret, not the Margaret of Navarre, but another Margaret. And the person actually who's behind the power is actually Catherine de' Medici. And we've talked about the de' Medici family. They were Italian, and they were very, very powerful family. And so Catherine, who's their mother, is actually behind the scenes trying to rule the country via proxy through her children. So how would you think about interfering mothers? Well, talk about interfering mothers. This lady, her objective was to rule France. And that's what she tried to do through her kids. And she knew that there were other rivals for the power in France. And this is the problem, is when you have a big country with lots of powerful people in it, you have lots of rivals. And first off, there's the House of Guise, I believe is how it's pronounced, Guise. I think it's pronounced Guise. If it's not...
You'd say the S because there's an E after.
Oh, I would say yes. Geese? Geese. Okay, so good. Somebody knows French. I don't.
I'm glad you know.
Yeah, really. Geese. Okay. Geese sounds so much nicer, though. The Geese family? I don't know. But it is. The House of Geese. And there were also what they called princes of the blood, in other words, in the royal line out there. And then particularly Antoine de Bourbon and his brother Louis de Conde, or de Conde, C-O-N-D-E. These two guys. Now, the House of Guise was staunchly Catholic and wanted to stamp out Protestantism. Okay, so are we setting up our battle lines here? We end up with the fact that these guys are going to keep fighting. And one of the guys, Conde Louis, was implicated in a plot to seclude the king away from the Guise family. So they arrest him. Now, then Francis II dies, which is always good for stability. And Catherine takes over for Charles IX, since he was young at the time. And they, of course, then, she's hostile towards the Guise family because they're trying to take the throne. And she wants the throne for her kids, or for her. And so she fights with them. So what do you think she's going to do? She's going to release the enemies of the Guise and, of course, have to tacitly support Protestantism, right? Because she wants the allies from the Protestantism. If you notice here, it's all theology. Everybody's agreeing doctrinal issues, right? When you're dealing with politics, you can throw all that stuff out the window. Eventually, the Huguenots, by the way, are the people who are the French Protestants. They're referred to as Huguenots. So that's whenever I say the Huguenots, that's the French Protestants. Eventually, in 1562, if you notice here, we've jumped from 47 to 62. She endorses what's called the Edict of Saint Germain and grants freedom to the Huguenots to practice a religion, but limits them from owning property, collecting funds, or supporting any army. Okay, so how would you like that? Hey, you can do stuff, but you can't collect funds, and you can't own property, and you can't have an army. We don't even think about it. People owning an army, well, remember, this was not unusual at this time. Groups and kings and kingdoms and princes and regions could have their own armies. We always think national armies today, but that's a very recent trend. Very recent. In this particular time, national armies were kind of sketchy at best because you barely had nations. Now, you got to go back to the Roman Empire, to find quote-unquote national armies, the Roman legions. So these guys said, okay, you can practice your worship, but you can't raise an army. Yeah, that's the mission of a church, right? Yeah, let's go raise an army. But in those days, you didn't have anybody else to protect you, so a lot of times people would raise armies. Okay, the king's not going to protect us, so we'll raise our army. So this edict gives some limited freedom. Now, the Guise refuse to support this, and they attack this village of Vassy and kills as many Huguenots as they can. So as you can tell, they're pretty dead set that we really don't like the Protestants. This massacre is just the beginning of their ultimate objectives, because their ultimate objective is to wipe out Protestantism, kill them all, and let God sort them out. And in their view, just kill them all, because that's all they're worried about. And we end up with a whole series of wars that are going to go on. It gets a little quiet for a short period of time when one of the dukes is assassinated, who's their main general. But we end up with two more wars in 1567 and 1570. Okay, how do you think life is going in France right now? Not so much. But guess what it's all being blamed on? Religion and those evil, Isn't it great? Religion has nothing to do with this. this has to do with politics. Religion is merely being used as a front or a mask for it. So a lot of people say, oh, all these wars are caused by religion. Not really. Yes, the House of Guise did not like Protestants, but that was just an excuse because they really wanted power. And it wasn't the king supporting Protestantism had nothing to do with whether they really supported Protestantism or not. It's they needed Protestant support against the House of Guise. So, again, don't let people fool you into thinking all of these things are religiously based. Now, later on, we're going to see that we do see rulers who do definitively talk about religion, and religion does come into play. But right now, this is just warring houses within France. Eventually, we get to this thing which is referred to as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Now, if you remember, I mentioned this back when we were talking about Reformation in Britain, and we talked about John Knox. This was this whole event that we're going to talk about next. At the end of this is where Knox, who had been bedridden, looked like probably a stroke or something, just before he dies, he hears about this massacre. And he gets up and sort of preaches his last sermon and says, you guys need to stand strong, otherwise this could happen to you. And this was some of the reinforcing stuff that echoed into Scotland. And so this event really catalyzes a lot of, if you will, polarization within Protestantism, Catholicism, and across all the nations. Because this is very, very brutal. Now, what ends up happening is in 1571, Catherine de' Medici wants to grant some openness to Protestantism, again, to support their cause, if you will. And one of the leaders of the Protestant happened to be an admiral, and I think it's Gaspard de Coligny, or something like that. Coligny. He was invited to court. He was now, notice, French admiral. Okay? He's invited, he's a Protestant, he's invited to the court, and he makes such an impression on the young king. He later admires him so much, he calls him my father. So, I mean, this guy is class act, very God-honoring man, military leader, gracious. I mean, so he's kind of one of the leaders of Protestantism. So this isn't the foaming at the mouth, crazy kind of stuff. This guy's an actually pretty solid dude. And eventually, there ends up being plans for good old Margaret of Valois, whatever, to marry the Protestant prince Henry Bourbon, or Bourbon, or however it's pronounced. And as this marriage goes forward, the House of Guise plans to kill Coligny. All right, and this is on August 18th, 1572. After the wedding of Henry Bourbon, who is now the King of Navarre, a gunman shoots the admiral but does not kill him. So he goes on, if you will, convalescence. So he gets shot but not killed. So this guy's in bed in Paris. But after this diligent investigation, it appears that the House of Guise, or Guise, is behind it. Geez, surprise. Who would try to kill the leader of Protestantism in there, especially if he's making a favorable impression on the king who wants to call him father, right? Speculation, it's Henry of Anjou. There's the pair guy. So you can link things together. That's the Henry. Or later he'll become Henry III. Eventually, Catherine convinces Charles that it was a Huguenot plot. Now think about this. A Huguenot plot to overthrow them. A Huguenot plot to overthrow them, to kill their leader. Okay. All right. Good theology here. Bible study. Now, politics. Still more politics. And so she, with her son, now conspires with the House of Guise to kill the Huguenots. I don't understand all of this, so I'm not even going to try to explain it. So how would you have the people that you're trying to ally with killed? Well, the only reason you do that is because they're a threat to the throne. Or you think they're a threat to the throne. So they end up setting up what's referred to as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. So on August 24th, this is August 18th, August 24th, 1572, Charles and Catherine and the Duke of Guise takes over a systematic killing of thousands in Paris. And so the admiral who's convalescing is shot in his bed, tossed out the window, and kicked by the Duke of Guise, killed, mutilated, and hung by a gibbet, which means a gallows. So if you were wondering whether he was dead, shot, thrown out the window, killed, mutilated, and hung. Just to make sure. I don't think they burned him, but that probably would have been the next step. So, needless to say, this was the signal to go kill the Huguenots. And they had set this up to have the Huguenots massacred everywhere in France. All right? Talk about a bad day. That's the reason this is a very significant event. Because some of the people in France, the leaders, did not honor the order, but most did. And so the Huguenots, they were trying to wipe them out in a day. Just go kill them all as much as you can. Now think about that. Think about the order from your government that says, when you see this happen, go kill everybody who claims to be a Huguenot. That is pretty severe. What ends up happening is two of the Protestant princes, de Conti and Bourbon, are dragged before the king, and to save their lives, they recant Protestantism. Guess what's going to happen? They're going to go back and forth, depending on who's in power, about whether they're Protestant or they're Catholic, or they're Protestant or they're Catholic. Well, they were Protestant leaders, now they're Catholic. Saves their life, though. And when Europe awakens to this news, the Pope and Philip II of Spain, remember we had Charles V, now we got Philip II, were of course outraged against this horrible thing. So in outrage, they order the singing of the Te Deum, glorious, praise thing, and order other celebrations. But they were very bad. This is really, really bad, so I want you to celebrate it. Talk about personas. This is my public face, and here's my private face. Maximilian II, though he was Catholic, was an honorable man. Remember, Maximilian was the guy, a ruler in who had retired, Maximilian was in Austria. Forgive me, I can't remember which Maximilian because there's too many of them. But he was Catholic. He was horrified. Elizabeth, England, wore mourning clothes as a result of this. Okay? So this was a big turning point. What ends up happening now is we get the War of the Three Henrys. And because of this, a lot of people who were Protestant who sort of sat on the sideline and said, why are we doing this? There's no reason we should fight. We get along with our neighbors. They've decided if they're willing to kill us all, we're willing to fight back. It's not because of Protestantism or Catholicism. I'm just willing to fight back because I'm not just going to let people just kill me out of hand for the sake of killing me out of hand because they don't like what I believe. And so you now end up with the Protestants willing to stand up and fight. And some of the more moderate Catholics said, we are sick and tired of this war and fighting. We'll actually join the Protestants if that'll help stop the fighting. So again, it's not theology now. It's we'd like some peace in our life. Right? So now you have moderate Catholics and Protestants fighting against more radical Catholics. It's just kind of crazy, but that's kind of how it works. Charles IX is unable to rule because he's young, and he dies in 1572. So it's very short rule. And you end up with good old Henry of Anjou, or Henry III, who comes into power. And Henry III is actually one of the guys who was behind the massacre. Now think about that. Or at least most people think he was. But what does Henry now do? Do I want to have a kingdom that I'm ruling that's constantly at war, or do I want the one that's sort of at peace? So he then turns around and, as the magnificent king, says, hey, Protestants, you guys can have some freedom of worship. Anybody getting confused yet? But this is what happens when religion and politics get intermixed. So they offer some freedom out, except in Paris. Now, in Paris, you got to be Catholic. If you can't, nothing goes on in Paris unless you're Catholic. Of course, the House of Guy doesn't support this, and with Spanish support, attacks Henry and the Huguenots. Okay, now suddenly the king is with the Huguenots, and the House of Guy and the Spanish are now attacking. And this ends up being the 8th war in a series, which is basically destroying the country. Because you can imagine what happens. They destroy this, they destroy this, they destroy this, they destroy this. I mean, just look at what's going on in the Mideast right now. You build up a city, it gets wiped out, you take it, somebody takes it back. I mean, people are like, come on. I mean, let's stop this mess. Now, at this point, Henry III's youngest brother dies, and that leaves Henry with no heir except Henry of Bourbon, who is the king of Navarre, who, oh, by the way, happens to be a Protestant, who, oh, by the way, is going to change sides again, because the Catholics won't tolerate a Protestant king. Henry, I mean, I'm not going to go through all the battles, but Henry III eventually is defeated. He flees to Henry Bourbon's protection. Henry the Bourbon recognizes Henry III as the rightful king, and oh, by the way, Henry Bourbon is the rightful successor. And so he protects him in Navarre and says, yes, you're king of France. Oh, by the way, I'm in charge. And so eventually, a disgruntled friar, I think it is friar, enters Bourbon's camp and kills Henry III. With his death, now you got Henry Bourbon, who declares himself Henry IV. Right? So now we got Henry IV, who is of Navarre, who is over France, who is a Protestant. Now, how well do you think that's going to go over with anybody? It isn't. So the Pope goes against him, declares it invalid. Philip II of Spain plots to take France, and this war continues on for 4 more years. But nobody's strong enough to beat anybody, so eventually the great politician, Henry IV, switches him because I'm Catholic now. Because now that he's Catholic, nobody can be against him. Except he supports the Huguenots. Understand the compromise in politics that has nothing to do with religion? So he becomes a Catholic champion of Protestantism. But he gets to be king. Because now he's in power and can actually protect the Protestants in France. And he issues an Edict of Nantes, I guess, or Nantes, which gives them, the Huguenots, freedom of worship everywhere except for Paris. People still don't like Henry, and eventually in 1610, he's assassinated by a fanatical Catholic. Because they said, you favor Protestantism too much. Like, it's because he was a Protestant originally. Okay, anybody want to go to France during the Reformation? Nah. Okay, now let's turn ourselves from Protestant Reformation to Catholic Reformation. And guess what, folks? The Catholics reformed. However, it was in practice, not in theology. A matter of fact, on theology, they doubled down. Not we're giving an inch. As a matter of fact, we're solidifying things even harder. So we're going to see a whole development here that is going to shift what is today the modern Catholic Church. Remember, I've said during this whole thing, what you think of the Catholic Church today is not the Catholic Church up to this point. This is when the birth of what you would refer to as the modern Catholic Church. And when I say modern Catholic Church, I'm still talking about the Italian-based papal Catholic Church, because the American Catholic Church, who knows? I think most of the Europeans would just as soon get rid of the Catholic Church here because they're not Catholic. They're so all over the place. Same thing with South America. But the doctrine that's established. Question?
Well, since we missed the last couple of weeks, could you kind of just touch on briefly what is really at this point so different between the Catholicism and Protestantism? I think we're missing, us wrestling.
What's the difference between
we're missing where you're now coming into where they're going to be okay? You know, I mean,
The Catholics are not going to be okay with Protestantism. Matter of fact, this whole lesson is going to show what the Catholics do. They clean up the practices of the Catholic Church, but they do not clean up the theology of the Catholic Church. It's the theological differences between Catholicism and Protestantism, not the practical things. The practical things just ended up being manifestations. Remember, we talked about the 97 theses were theologic and nobody cared. The 95 theses were practical with theology behind them for the most part. Those are what people cared about. And so Reformation in the Catholic Church is going to end up being cleaning up the practices, indulgences, and things like that, not the theology. Matter of fact, they double down and fight point by point, tooth and nail against Protestant theology. Matter of fact, in the end of the notes here, we actually have some of the canons about justification that you can read for yourself. These are still standing today. They come out of the Council of Trent, which we'll talk about here in a sec. But let's begin with some of the beginning of the transformation and Reformation within the Catholic Church at this particular time. And we actually have to move back into the 15th century, late 15th century, the 1400s. Because in Spain, under Isabella and Ferdinand of, Christopher Columbus fame, we end up with the beginnings of actual cleaning up bad practices, not theology, bad practices. But you're going to see it's really interesting what happens. You realize that at this particular time period, we see the growth of the nation states, and the papacy's been in decline, right? We've watched that over this time period. It hit its peak in Innocent III in the early 13th century, when he could basically dictate anything to anybody. And it kind of went downhill from there. Well, what we're going to see is the Catholic Church is going to end up having to redefine itself. After it kind of loses control over secular Europe, even though it's still involved in it a lot. Not saying that it's lost total control, but it's losing its power base. And people start turning, they see Luther's coming up, they see other people coming up. They begin to shift and now become the power over the church. They're not so much the power over the states anymore. And this is this transition from the late 1400s into the early 1600s, which is the time period we're talking about. But the beginning of this follows on with the Spanish Catholicism. And if you remember, we talked about the Reconquista, 700 years of taking Spain slowly but surely back from the Moors and Islam. Well, Ferdinand and Isabella are instrumental in that. And in 1492, they're the ones, send off Columbus, and they also take out the last Islamic stronghold in Spain. So these guys are really involved in a whole bunch of stuff from major history, but a lot of times we don't understand all of the things they do. First off, Isabella was crowned queen in 1474 and gains permission from the Pope to clean up and appoint high I can't even say it, ecclesiastical. There it is. Man, I am having trouble with language this morning. Posts. Her husband Ferdinand of Aragon gets the same permission. And he wants to do it for political reasons. She wants to do it for religious reasons. Because Isabella found support in her personal confessor. Now, I'll mess this one up too. Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, I don't know. Cisneros. Oh, okay, Cisneros. Okay. I put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. And he was a devout Franciscan. Remember, we talked about the Franciscan monks. He spends 10 years in prison for refusing to participate in corrupt practices of his day. Okay, so here's a guy who says, these practices are so corrupt, I won't do them as a man of God. And he spends time in prison. That guy's got some backbone. Because in the day, they just sort of, most of the time they'd roll over. And while he's in prison, he studies Hebrew and Chaldean. Here, remember, we talked about all the stuff that's coming back and the languages and all the stuff. This guy spends his time for 10 years studying these languages. And when the Archbishop of Toledo dies, Isabella wants to appoint him to that post. He says, no. Okay. What do you think the queen's going to do? Is she going to take no for an answer? No, so she appeals to the Pope, who happens to be Alexander VI at this particular time, who's not a reforming Pope, but a political one, and forces Jimenez to accept that post. And from then on, she, Isabella, and this new archbishop go about personally, hi, I'm going to visit the queen, and the new archbishop is going to come to your town. And it ain't Santa Claus, because if you're naughty, she's going to make you nice or else. Pretty much, you're going to reform or you're toast, because I have the power of the archbishop, ecclesiastical postings, and the Pope behind me. Because she's very serious about cleaning up the abuses. All right? Now, if you notice, we're not talking doctrine here. So, Cisneros ends up printing books. They end up printing books, establishing a university, and he had the scriptures put in a parallel text, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And this is an update of the Latin Vulgate. Remember, nobody can touch the Latin Vulgate except the church. Well, he dares putting basically a parallel Bible together with Latin and Hebrew and Greek in it. You should be saying, yay! And the guy puts it all together. He even includes a Hebrew grammar, a Chaldean grammar, and a Greek grammar. I mean, this guy is, all right, let's get the Bible, now still in Latin, but let's get it so people can go back to it. He finishes this in 1517. Oh, interesting. 1517, when Luther posted his 95 Theses. It's not published till 1520. And he is quoted as saying, this edition of the Bible that, at this critical time, opens the scriptural sacred sources of our religion, from which will flow a much purer theology than any derived from less direct sources. Great guy. If he had said this just a few years later, you know what he would have been accused of? Being a Lutheran heretic. As I have in the notes, timing is everything. He got away with it, doing some of the same things Luther was trying to do, except he's not putting it in Spanish. He's trying to bring scholarship. He's trying to go back to the original sources, like the humanists we talked about. He's trying to do all this stuff, and it's going to make our religion purer. Unfortunately, it's not going to turn out so much that way, because as you can tell, if Isabella and him are going to go around and force people to do what they say, he's probably going to be a bit on the zealous side of things, which he does. He ends up, the scholarship kind of go to the side because the Spanish Inquisition is taking more and more political tone. So it's no longer dealing with doctrinal heresy. It starts taking on, I can use this as a political weapon. And there's a Dominican friar, I think it's Torquemada. It's pretty close. Hey, that's not bad. Was forcibly converting Jews to Christianity. And they're trying to forcibly convert Muslims to Christianity. And they're trying to make everybody, you're going to become a Christian or else. And in 1492, isn't this a popular year? They declare that you must convert to Christianity or leave the country. And he's telling this to the Jews. There are approximately 200,000 Jews leave the nation. A significant portion of them die because nobody wants 200,000 Jews wandering around. The Jews were not liked. Which is interesting is a lot of the stuff in the scholarship and the academics and things like that, they had left Constantinople and came to Europe, and now Europe's sending them back, which props up the Ottoman Empire because they have banking and all sorts of other skills that the Muslims go, Because at that time, Islam was actually far more conciliatory towards Christians than Christians were towards each other. Interesting irony. But that's a whole other thing about whether people were practicing Islam and people of the book, which means Christians and Jews. They lived in relative peace for quite a long time versus what you see today. Completely different. So Jimenez ends up helping become Grand Inquisitor, or if he's now busy practicing chasing down Muslims, because in this same year, 1492, Islam falls in Spain, the last vestiges. So now you have this guy who's the zealous reformer, who's the head of the Inquisition, who is now forcing Jews and Muslims to try to convert. If you notice here, there's this zeal to save their souls, and oh, by the way, if they die in the process, oh well, I saved their soul. That becomes the thinking pattern of the Inquisition. Now, in 1516, jumping ahead a little bit, Ferdinand and Isabella die, and they leave Jimenez as the regent of Spain. And he continues his harsh policies and only gets rebellion. So all of that zeal for scholarship goes by the wayside, because we got to get them all to convert. Guys, it is never a good idea to force people to convert to anything. Okay? Lesson learned from history, all the way from prior to Charlemagne, all the way to here. If you go down that path, you're going to be in big trouble. Okay? That doesn't mean share, evangelize, but force usually doesn't work out well. And we'll see that it doesn't. Now, the Catholics, however, are not going to sit by idly with Protestantism, because now that it's grown, the doctrine is developed. You got Luther and people like that, Calvin, who are developing the doctrinal stuff. So the Catholics have to become a little bit more organized besides just saying you're wrong. They actually are going to have to argue with what's going to happen. And so they end up with guys like John Eck. And if you remember, we talked about John Eck, who debates Luther and Karlstadt. By the way, Karlstadt was a guy who was the sort of the guy when Luther was in Wittenberg, or not in Württemberg Castle. He was in Wittenberg sort of stirring up things. He kind of pushed things way beyond what Luther wanted. Karlstadt was really smart, but he was like overly zealous. And Luther wasn't real crazy about what he did. But John Eck, who was a scholar and attentive pastor, he wasn't this vagrant guy. He studied, he believed, he served, he did what he was supposed to do as he did. He creates his own translation of Scripture in German, which is kind of interesting. Ooh, wait a second, they're not supposed to do that, and yet he does that, and he's doing it to combat Luther in Germany. And then there's other ones who established some universities that fight both Protestants and humanists. This guy named James Latomas. And he develops a systematic defense with guys named Robert Bellamar and Cesar Baronis. These guys their works are so good in dealing with point by point, dealing with Protestant theology. They were developed in 1593. If you notice, we've just shifted towards the end, 40 years later. These guys were so good that they're still considered some of the best works against Protestantism. Okay? Written over 400 years ago. So from a Catholic perspective, those works written by these guys are some of the principal arguments that a Roman Catholic, Jesuit priest, whoever, scholar is going to use, and saying, well, this isn't true, or that's not true, or we see it differently, kind of thing. So they develop quite a bit of skill there. One of these guys was also part of Galileo's trial about the earth moving around the sun, and declared him heretical. By the way, just as a historical note, the Catholic Church knew that the earth revolved around the sun when they had Galileo on trial. They actually talked with him and said, look, Galileo, we know you're right. Our scholars have demonstrated it, but we've been teaching the Aristotelian view for 1,000 years. Please shut up and let us eventually let this understanding get out through the church, not through you. And of course, Galileo kindly said, sure. No, he didn't. That's what got him into trouble. The church already knew Galileo was correct. So he just wouldn't shut up. So it's interesting. But these guys end up also creating what's referred to as Ecclesiastical Annals, which is a Catholic rebuttal of the Centuries of Magdeburg. These two works are some of the very first works of what we would consider modern church history. Okay? Believe me, the works of the ecclesiastical history of Eusebius, if you read it, you'd be like, this is a history? These guys are developing what we would consider modern history. So even the literary genre of modern history that we're so familiar with really is a relatively new thing. So I hate to tell you this, but the historical books of the Old Testament aren't historical books of the Old Testament. They are referred to as the former prophets by the Jews, just so you know. They're historical framework, but not history in this context and a literary genre, but historical. So there's a difference between those two things. All right? Because the Jews considered them prophetic literature. But that's a whole other class. So this is where the Protestants were saying, see, the Catholic Church has gone off historically from Protestantism, or from the original doctrine, and the Catholics are saying, no, we haven't. So this was written from a historical development, and that's what they did. Now, we end up with a couple of new monastic orders, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on these. I'm going to leave those for you to read in your notes. But first off was the Discalceded Carmelites, and this is developed by a lady named Saint Teresa, and discalceded means barefoot. They wore sandals instead of shoes. And she was from a poor home. She went to a monastery or convent, and she felt that it was lax and it wasn't God-honoring. And she's in Spain. And she was an avid reader, and unfortunately, during the Spanish Inquisition, all of the prohibited book lists included all of her favorites, including some of the best Catholic works, which is kind of weird. But she eventually has a vision that Jesus tells her, "Fear not, for I shall be to you like an open book." So in other words, okay, your books are gone, but I'm going to be an open book to you. And from there on, she has more and more and more visions. She's perplexed and says, is this a demon or is this God? She eventually is convinced that this is God, not a demon, and presses on from there. She establishes a new monastery with a more rigorous life. With her more rigorous holy life, she convinces a lot of royals and a lot of nobles and a lot of other people that what she's doing is good, but she is a mystic. This is the development of a lot of the mystic Catholicism, and she is very contemplative, and her works are considered classic devotional literature from a mystical perspective. And in 1970, Pope Paul VI adds hers to the doctors of the Catholic Church. Catherine of Siena is the only other woman doctor of the Catholic Church. And so she works also with St. John of the Cross, and is the only woman ever to found a monastic movement that includes both men and women. So that develops. So now what are you starting to see? You're starting to see that Reformation type of idea of practice in this monastic movement. Then we end up with Ignatius Loyola. There it is, Loyola. And I'm not going to go to his past, just say the guy wanted to be a military leader. He gets hurt in battle. He has pain. He has a vision. And he's kind of like Luther in a sense that he wants to confess all his sins, and he keeps confessing. And eventually, we're not sure exactly what it is, but he says, from that day on, he was free of his scruples, to be certain that the Lord had wished him to be freed by his mercy. But nobody knows what that meant. So he ends up trying to go to Israel to evangelize the Turks, because remember the Ottoman Turks were in charge of the Mideast at this time. And the Christians there said, you're too zealous and radical and stubborn. Go home. You're not helping us. And he goes home and becomes a scholar, goes to several universities. And in 1534, he returns to Montserrat, where he has some men he's picked up in this particular travel across the universities, and they make a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the Pope. Eventually, what comes out of this is the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. He petitions to form a new monastic order, and the Jesuits are perfect for combating Protestantism. They basically become the theologic, missional shock troops of the Catholic Church going forward. The Jesuits are very well educated. They are military ordered. They're structured like a military. So it's like, Jeff, go here. Bob, go here, and they go. So they were very efficient and very effective about dealing with doctrine and other type of stuff. So the Jesuits become a dominant force that the papacy uses to enforce Catholic doctrine, purity, and orthodoxy going forward. And this is the guy who establishes the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. The papacy, as I mentioned, now begins to rise in power, not so much in the secular world, though it still has influence, but in the Catholic Church universal. One of the sections we sort of skipped over is, guess where, 1492, what's happening? New World, Spain, Portugal, Central America, South America, all that stuff's going over there. So what do you need? Reach around the world. You see trade with all of the guys going around the world to Japan and, things like that. You end up with Catholicism reaching farther and farther around the world. And so these guys are sort of the major missionaries and scholars that go along with the Catholic Church. The papacy does this. Unfortunately, they end up with forbidden books. They ban a lot of stuff. And in 1555, a cardinal takes over and becomes Paul IV, and he corrects, to his credit, many of the ills within the Catholic Church practice. Okay, difference between theology. He doesn't touch the theology. So let's do real quickly the Council of Trent. And we have, like I said, some of the notes in here that you can go along with. Well, as you can imagine, if you're starting to lose ground to the Protestants, you're going to say, hey, let's call a council. Let's get everybody together and call a council. Well, a lot of us think Council of Trent, hey, everybody got together for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and yay, we studied a few things, dealt with the heresy, and moved on. Well, the Council of Trent didn't work that way. The Council of Trent was established in a city in northern Italy in December of 1545. And this was under Charles V. That's his region. It starts off with the first session with 31 church leaders in attendance. Okay, that's out of all of Europe. 31 leaders. The last session had only 213 leaders. So these earlier councils that were just dealing with one issue had way more people. But this council is not dealing with just an issue. It is dealing with reform in the church and point by point dealing with the doctrine of the Protestants. And this particular council meets in 1545, 1551, 1562, and the last meeting was in 1563. So if you notice here, from 1545 to 1563 is the quote-unquote Council of Trent. All right, so it's very different than when we think council. It's a whole series of meetings over several decades. And they end up with dealing with a lot of stuff, like bishops can only reside in their own see. In other words, you can't just be an absentee bishop. You can't have two posts, so you can't have two of them to gain income from. What is the obligations of the clergy? What about relics and indulgences? What about, they found seminaries to train their folks, right? The Protestants are doing it, we need to do it too. They promote that the theology of Thomas Aquinas, we've talked about Thomas Aquinas, becomes the dominant theological perspective to this day. Okay, study Thomas Aquinas. Summa Theologica, got some great stuff in it, also got some stuff he didn't quite get right. But this is the theology of Catholicism. The Latin translation of Vulgate is authoritative in all matters of dogma. Declared, and see here it is, it declared that the tradition has the authority parallel to the Scriptures. This is when it gets declared. Prior to that time, it may have functionally been that way, but this is when it gets declared that that is true. It defines that there were 7 sacraments. It states that the Mass is a true sacrifice and can be offered for the benefit of the dead. That's why they had to add the apocryphal books to the canon in the Catholic Church, because they needed it to support this particular doctrine. Justification, or communion in both kinds, is not necessary. Justification is based on good works done through collaboration between grace and the believer. Justification, not sanctification, justification. Big deal. This is the theologic break between Protestantism and Catholicism. And they pronounce anathemas or curses on anyone who believed in justification by grace alone, through faith alone. Now, a modern Catholic scholar will tell you, well, we believe in that, but grace alone and faith alone are completely defined differently than we would define it. So if somebody says, oh, we believe in grace alone by faith alone, they do. But the definitions of those words and the meanings of what they are completely different. So the words are the same, the meanings are different. So this is basically what develops modern Catholicism. Now, before anybody gets smug, how many mainline solid Protestant denominations who would have been part of this group or that fell out of it have stayed solid? Not many. Only remnants of a few of them. Bits and pieces. Now, one thing that you have to realize, the official doctrine of the Catholic Church has very little to do with the official doctrine of any individual Catholic. Whenever you're dealing with any individual, don't say, well, they're a this or they're a that, therefore they believe. Because most of them don't. Right? If you're saying, here's the official position, that's one thing. If you're saying, what do you believe, that's what's important, not what the official position of the group is. I met a man who I listened to him, and he was a very staunch Catholic and reading the Pope's encyclics and readings every day and all this stuff, and he shared with me, no, you're saved by grace through faith alone. I asked him all the definitions of what he meant by that. It was like, do you realize that you are a Protestant? So, no, I'm a very staunch Catholic. I said, do you understand that the Catholic Church pronounced anathema in the Council of Trent, and it's still doctrine today, of what you believe? Oh, no, the Pope would never do that. So I went, praise God, he's a believer. It's the guy got it, but he's a staunch Catholic. And he cares about people and good works and helping folks out. He doesn't believe work saves him or anything. So whenever you're dealing with folks, there's the official position, which, by the way, we have some of the councils on, the canons on justification in the notes. But then there is the individual. Deal with the person. Regardless of what background they came from, no matter what their denominational affiliation, no matter where they are, deal with the scriptures and deal with the person. Don't group people. Because today, who knows what anybody believes, right? Be faithful to God's word and deal with the person, because that's the soul that's saved. You're not trying to save a denomination or religion, etc. But this is what the basis of the modern Catholic Church is founded on. The Council of Trent and all the stuff that went along with it. There's been little tweaks and little inflections along the way, but this is what we see today. This is where it began.
But there also are staunch Catholics that do believe this.
Oh, there are staunch Catholics who do believe this stuff, yes, and that's completely different. Like I said, deal with the individuals. And some are very staunch Catholics who believe in this stuff, and you're like, you're not saved by works, I'm sorry. And other ones who will clearly tell you right to your face, of course not. That's not what the Bible says. Question.
Communion in both kinds is not necessary. What is it?
That was dealing with bread and wine and who could be given to the laity and all that kind of stuff. So that was one of the establishment of Protestantism that the Catholics said, you don't need that kind of stuff.
The bread and the wine?
Originally, I think it was the lady could handle the bread but not the wine, and then that would be given in both kinds. And here they're saying, no. It all comes from the priest. The sacraments are all the body and the blood and all that kind of stuff, because Protestantism started with that other kind of thinking that you could do in both kinds.